All of Vernon County thought Elmer Haugen had lost his mind, because in the hardest autumn of his life, with the bank on his back, he took in a runaway boy nobody wanted and spent what little he had teaching him a trade. People laughed. Some of his neighbors even called him a fool. "You can barely feed yourself, Elmer," they said, "and now you're taking in a stranger off the road?" Elmer wouldn't see that boy again for more than 30 years. Then, on the worst night of his life, as the barn his father had built with his own hands stood in flames, a line of trucks came up the valley's dirt road, and what rose from the ashes that night left the entire valley silent. But to understand that, you have to go back to the beginning. It was October of 1968, in a narrow valley outside Westby, one of those steep, wooded hollows people in Wisconsin call a coulee. In the first light of morning, frost had turned the meadow silver, and inside the barn the air smelled of warm animal breath, hay and milk. Elmer Haugen was 47 years old, his shoulders broadened by a lifetime of both milking cows and shaping wood, his hands carrying the calluses of both trades. He kept 26 Holstein cows, all of them tied in a row inside the big, gambrel-roofed barn his father had built back in the 1930s. That year, the price of milk was $4.58 per hundredweight, and Elmer shipped his milk down to the cheese factory at the bottom of the valley. But the check that came back was worth less and less. It had been a bad year. The repairs never ended, and unopened letters from the bank were piling up in the bottom drawer of his desk. His wife, Ruth, chestnut hair going grey now, was a calm but sturdy woman, the kind whose quiet strength holds a family together through the hard times. They had never had children. There was no one to pass the big barn to, or the craft, or everything a lifetime had gathered. And though Elmer never said it out loud, he felt that loneliness every morning as he walked into the barn. Elmer's father, Anders Haugen, was a barn builder who had come over from Norway. He had raised dozens of barns up and down the valley. He taught his son the only way teaching a craft ever truly works, by standing beside him. As a boy, Elmer had learned how to square a beam with an axe, how to cut a tenon and its mortise, how to drive an oak peg instead of a nail. When Anders died one cold winter, he left Elmer a few acres of land, that barn, and a chest full of hand tools. But the thing Elmer valued most was his father's hammer, the handle worn until it had taken the shape of a hand, his father's initials carved into the head. Elmer kept that hammer not like a tool, but like a vow, because his father had said one sentence to him, over and over: a tool is worth only what it builds. And Elmer had never forgotten that he too had once been a boy with nothing. He knew what hunger meant in the Depression years, and what it meant to go to school in patched trousers. That was why, on that October morning, when he saw the boy walking slowly up the valley road, what he saw was not a stranger. At first he took him for just another traveler. Now and then someone would pass through rural Wisconsin like that. But this boy was different. He walked as if every step took effort. His clothes were covered in dust. The pack on his back had come apart at nearly every seam, and the soles of his boots were separating from the leather. As he came closer, Elmer saw how thin he was. Close to 6 feet tall, but nothing but skin and bone. What stopped Elmer was the boy's eyes. Not lazy, not spoiled, just tired. The kind of tired that comes from life dumping too much disappointment on a person too early. "Can I help you?" Elmer asked. The boy hesitated before he spoke. "Name's Wade, sir," he said. "I'm looking for work." When Elmer asked where he was from, the boy lowered his eyes, and slowly the truth came out. His mother had remarried years ago. Things with his stepfather had grown worse and worse. And one night, an argument turned into an ultimatum. Leave and don't come back. Wade had set out with a bag and less than $40. "I don't need much," he said quietly. "A meal, maybe a few hours of work." Logic told Elmer to say no. The farm couldn't carry even a temporary hand. His own numbers didn't add up. That week, one of the neighbors down the valley heard Elmer had taken the boy in and said it out loud at the coffee counter. "Haugen can barely feed his own cows, and now he's going to feed some drifter off the street?" The men beside him laughed. They didn't mean any harm by it. It was more like not being able to make sense of a foolish thing a hard-working man had done. But when Elmer looked at that boy, he saw a copy of his own youth, the youth that life had very nearly defeated. "Have you eaten today?" he asked. Wade hesitated. That hesitation told Elmer everything. "Come on," Elmer said. "Supper's almost ready." It was impossible to miss the relief that crossed the boy's face. That evening, Wade sat at the Haugens' table. He ate slowly at first, then with a growing hunger, as Ruth filled his plate a second and a third time. And there came a moment at that table when the room went quiet. Elmer watched the boy's fork touch the plate, watched that hungry but gentle way about him, and inside, he had already made his decision. The next morning, Elmer put him to work on the farm, and Wade worked harder than anyone expected. Harder, in fact, than most grown men. He was up before sunrise and didn't stop until dark. Never complained. Never acted like any job was beneath him. But the real thing happened in the evenings. When the work was done, Wade didn't go to the cows. He went to the workshop, to the bench, to where the wood was. While Elmer made a repair, the boy would stand quietly beside him, watching, learning, taking it all in. One evening, when Elmer was about to replace a broken stanchion board in the barn, Wade picked up the board, looked at the grain, and held the saw at such an angle that Elmer stopped and watched closely. The boy had made the cut right on the first try, and no one had shown him how. In that moment, Elmer understood something. This boy didn't love farming. He loved wood, he loved building, and he loved it with the same quiet love Elmer had carried inside himself for 40 years. After that day, Elmer began to teach him how to read the grain, how to square a beam with an axe, how to seat a tenon in its mortise and lock it with an oak peg. Within a few weeks, Wade was cutting joints. Within a few months, he was cutting the simple ones on his own. "How do you know all this?" the boy had asked in those early days, while Elmer was correcting a joint. "From my father," Elmer had said, "and he from his. The Haugens built half the barns in this valley." Wade was quiet for a long time, then asked softly, "Would you teach me too?" All Elmer did was hand him a chisel, but as he held out that chisel, something formed between the two of them that no words could hold. In the evenings, while Wade worked at that bench in the last light coming down through the rafters, Elmer would sometimes stand in the doorway and watch him, and his heart would both warm and ache, because in the boy's every movement he saw his father. As autumn drew to a close, Elmer faced a decision that would cost him dearly. If he wanted to give Wade a real future, the boy needed something this dying little dairy farm could never give him. A proper apprenticeship, training in a trade, a start that would open doors. There was a place in La Crosse that took on apprentices in the building trade, but Elmer didn't have the money. So he sold the one thing on the farm that had any real value. Bess, his best registered Holstein, the one he had raised from a calf. $750. No one understood it. The neighbors shook their heads again and said he had gotten rid of his best cow for a drifter. But the day Elmer put Wade on the bus to La Crosse, he felt something far stronger than fear. Hope. Before the bus pulled out, he pressed his father's old hammer into the boy's hand. "This was my father's," he said. "It's yours now. A tool is worth only what it builds. So build something with it." Wade held the hammer in his palm as if it were something that might break. Then the bus slipped down the valley road and out of sight. And Elmer Haugen did not know it would be more than 30 years before he saw that boy again. Or that the day he did, it would be the night he lost everything he had in the world. Those first months in La Crosse were far harder than Wade had imagined. At 15, alone, with almost no money in his pocket, he started at the very bottom of a construction crew. He hauled nails, stacked lumber, made other men's work easier all day long, and at night he stayed in a small room above a carpenter's garage. Some weeks he got by on nothing but bread and cheap canned food. One winter evening, counting the last few dollars in his hand, he seriously thought about quitting for the first time. He could go back to day labor. At least he'd have food in his belly. But that night, he took Elmer's hammer out of his bag, looked at those carved initials on the head, and remembered the sentence spoken before the bus pulled out. A tool is worth only what it builds. He put the hammer back and made himself a promise. No matter what, he would finish what he had started. That worn handle stayed at his workbench for the next 32 years. Wade became first a good carpenter, then a master, then a contractor with a crew of his own. Up and down western Wisconsin, he raised barns, houses, grain buildings, and his name spread as the man who knows the old ways but gets the job done on time. Life had carried him far from that valley, but the hammer was always there. And Wade had no idea that back in that old coulee on a dry night, everything Elmer had was about to burn. 32 years had passed faster than either man could have guessed. The farmer who had once sat a hungry boy at his table had grown old. In the autumn of 2000, Elmer Haugen was 79. The broad shoulders that had once lifted a sack alone now moved more slowly, and he woke each morning with his fingers stiff. Ruth had grown old too. Her hair had turned completely grey, but those calm green eyes were still the same. Over the years, milk prices had crushed the small farmer, and most of the farms in the valley had closed. Elmer had cut his herd down to 8 cows because he was struggling to care for them. Most of the land had emptied out, but one thing still stood tall. The big gambrel-roofed barn his father Anders had built, with his own hands back in the 1930s. That was where Elmer had learned his trade. It was where he had handed Wade his first chisel. That barn was not just a building. It was the heart of a lifetime, of 3 generations. And that autumn was unusually dry. The meadow had gone yellow. The hay was bone dry. The air was like tinder. The fire started in the middle of the night. Elmer was never entirely sure what caused it. Most likely it was the old wiring near the hayloft that hadn't been replaced in years. A single spark falling into dry hay was enough to burn the barn to the ground. What woke Elmer was the light. An orange flickering light coming through the window. When he ran outside, the roof of the barn was already in flames. The heat scorched a man's face, even from the far end of the yard. Smoke rose into the sky like a black column, and the beams were caving in one by one. The neighbors came. Someone moved the 8 cows into the shed next door. Someone else fought with hoses, but no one could save that roof. Elmer stood at the fence and watched. He watched the beams his father had squared with an axe, those joints he had locked with oak pegs, blacken and char and collapse. By the time morning came, all that was left of the barn was a soot-smelling skeleton, a smouldering ruin, and a few charred posts standing against the sky. Ruth took his arm, but Elmer said nothing. There was nothing he could say. The days that followed were even heavier. The insurance policy Elmer had paid into for decades but never updated covered only a third of what a new barn would cost. Rebuilding that barn with today's labor would cost far more money than Elmer would see in the rest of his life. He went to the bank for a loan, but the young manager was clear. They couldn't give a 79-year-old man a long-term construction loan. Elmer went home and, for the first time in his life, felt the thing he feared most come true. A century of what his family had built, turning to a heap of ashes in his hands. In the evenings he sat on the porch, staring at that blackened emptiness where the barn no longer stood. Ruth tried to say something warm to him, but they both knew. The barn was gone, and it wasn't coming back. Or so it seemed. On the other side of western Wisconsin, Wade had no idea any of this was happening. He was 47 now, There was little left of that hungry boy. His temples had gone grey, the years of work had broadened his shoulders, but the want of his youth had left him with a deep tenderness toward people in hard times. One afternoon, a young man on his crew, someone from Coolie country from over near Westby, mentioned something in passing. "Did you hear? Some old farmer's barn burned down over in Vernon County. Fella named Haugen." The room seemed to shrink. Wade set down what he was holding. He had not forgotten that name in 32 years. He made a few phone calls, and what he learned was worse than he had guessed. The insurance wasn't enough. The bank had said no, and the man who had once saved him was slowly losing everything. That evening, Wade sat alone in his office until late and looked for a long time at the old hammer that had been his for 32 years, sitting on his desk. Then he made a decision. This was not something to be handled from a distance. It was time to go home. That morning began like every other. Elmer got up before sunrise, put on his faded jacket and stepped onto the porch with a cup of coffee. Then he heard the engines. At first he thought it was some noise off in the distance, but the sound kept coming closer. He went to the fence and looked down the valley road, and his stomach knotted. From far down the dirt road coming up toward him, as far as the eye could see, was a line of trucks. After the letters that had been coming to him, Elmer feared the worst. The trucks pulled into the yard, men climbed out, toolboxes came off, but no one said a word about foreclosure. Then a man stepped down from the lead truck. In his 40s, sure of himself, but not arrogant, grey at the temples, his hands calloused from years of work. He looked straight at Elmer and smiled. "Mr. Haugen," he said quietly. "It's Wade." The cup slipped from Elmer's hand and shattered on the ground. Wade took something old from his pocket and opened his palm. The hammer, its handle worn. Anders's initials carved into the head. "You gave this to me," he said. And in that moment, the whole valley went silent. For days after, the trucks stayed on the farm. But it wasn't only Wade's crew that came. As word spread through the valley, the neighbors came one by one. The very men who had once laughed at Elmer for selling his cow for a drifter, or their sons, now stood in the yard with hammers in their hands. Because in these parts there was an old tradition. When a neighbor's barn burned, everyone came and raised the new one together. No one asked for pay, but each man knew that when the day came, the same would be done for him. The ruin was cleared, the foundations poured, and Wade and his crew set to work the old way, just as Anders had. They squared the beams, cut the mortises, joined the great frames on the ground. Then a crane lifted those frames into the air one by one, and the men set them in place. The women carried food to dozens of workers, and the whole valley worked together on that hillside for days. The new barn went up on the very spot where the old one had stood, with the craft Elmer had taught Wade, but this time by Wade's own hands. The day the barn's last beam was set in place, Wade climbed to the peak and drove the final oak peg with the old hammer, the same hammer that had been pressed into a boy's hand 32 years before. Then he came down and set the hammer in Elmer's hand. "A tool is worth only what it builds," he said. "This hammer built everything I have. Now, it's come back home." Elmer couldn't speak for a long while. Then he nodded, with the silence of a man who knows that something begun at a supper table 32 years ago had finally come full circle. Some men leave money behind, some leave land. Elmer, on one October morning, had given a hungry boy a meal, a chisel, and a chance. And that tiny seed had grown, years later, into the sturdiest barn in the valley. A runaway boy, an old hammer, a burning barn, and a new roof rising from its ashes. Elmer had once feared he would be the generation that lost what his father built. Instead, the boy he had fed years before had carried the craft forward and, in the end, brought it home. Maybe there's been someone like that in your life too. Someone who believed in you before you believed in yourself. Or maybe you were the one who reached out a hand to a stranger, expecting nothing in return, never knowing where that kindness would go. That's exactly what this channel is here for. Stories about how a quiet act of kindness can come back years later. If stories like these mean something to you, stay a while and subscribe, because there are many more stories to tell.